Can you remember your first years of teaching? You know, to be honest, for me, it was an absolute blur. It was a fog of stress and sink or swim. When I got to the end of those first couple of years, when the fog sort of lifted, I sort of reflected on where I was at as a teacher, and I was actually a little bit disappointed to see that I wasn't the teacher that I thought that I would be. I thought that I was going to be like Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating from Dead Poets. I actually even stood on a desk once. I was asked to get down. But you know, I wasn't this guy. And that troubled me. As you can see, spoiler alert, I was more like this guy here. I was talking for too long. I was the centre of the classroom. My students were passive. Sure enough, I didn't have any behaviour problems because my students were half asleep. And it's not the sort of teacher that I wanted to be. So I was probably getting a little bit disillusioned. You know, I'd made this change to teaching and I wasn't the teacher I wanted to be. So a little bit despondent one Friday night, I was flicking through the channels and I came across this wonderful French film. I just adore this teacher. He's so gentle. He's the guide on the side. Not the sage on the stage. He's a guide. What a wonderful, gentle guide. All of the students are engaged. They're actively learning. And he's just gently guiding them. Thank you, Chris. That's the sort of teacher I wanted to be. So I started learning French. Surely that was the answer. But no, so I just had a chance conversation with a colleague at a play date, one of my children's play dates one day, and he told me about flipped learning. And I thought, well, that's probably my sort of thing. So I went home and Googled it. This is the first thing that came up on Google. And I knew it was for me. So that was a massive aha moment for me. I just absolutely knew that that's what I needed to do. It was just perfect. But I knew it was going to be a lot of work. So I need to be really clear on why did I want to do it. John asked us and challenged us yesterday to be clear on what your why is. So I've reflected on this, and I guess it does change over time, but it's becoming absolutely crystal clear. See, I've got two children, 12 and 10, two lovely girls. And they're going to live till they're 100. They're going to be working for 50 years of their life, at least. They're going to have at least 3 careers, 7 jobs or more. So my why is thinking about their future and the future of all of the children that I teach. Because the employment landscape is changing significantly. Let's have a look at in which ways it's doing that. So here we can see a trend here at the top with the routine manual jobs. This is the last 30 years, and you can see routine manual jobs are decreasing. No real surprise there. But I reckon in the next 10 years, that's going to accelerate significantly. Think about how much technology has changed in the last 10 years. That's going to continue to go down. So many of those jobs, when I was in physiotherapy and I was trying to rehabilitate people, the fallback I had was console operator, toll booth operator, taking the money at the toll roads. Gone. You know, so many of these jobs that we used to try and that students would fall back into as manual routine jobs, gone or going. Now, and it's not just our routine manual jobs, it's our routine cognitive jobs as well. Bank tellers, gone, almost gone. So, you know, we can see a worrying trend there. So what's surviving is the non-routine jobs. Non-routine cognitive tasks, non-routine manual tasks are the ones that are on the rise. So there's actually 2 factors here. One, as you probably imagine, is automation. So these jobs are being replaced by machines and robots. But there's also another one, and that is offshoring. So jobs that don't require one-on-one face-to-face contact are being done cheaper, more efficiently, 24 hours a day, offshore in other countries. So there's 2 major influences that are disrupting the job market here in Australia. So what are the jobs that are going to be the safest are our non-routine personal jobs. The ones that require one-on-one contact and the ones that are non-routine. There's no point in us getting students really good at the things that computers can already do better than us. So what are computer strengths? Speed and accuracy. But what is it that humans can do far better than machines? You know, we're great at being, oh goodness, flexible, creative, problem solving, empathetic, so emotionally intelligent, being able to collaborate. All of these things are what humans do better than robots. These are the things that are going to be the last to be replaced by machines. These are the skills that we need to be developing in our students, because these are the ones that are going to be future-proof. The 21st century skills, as I'm sure you've heard them called before. Because at the end of the day, robots have poor emotional intelligence. We are far more empathetic than robots are. So here's the sort of skills that we need to develop in our students. Critical thinking, problem solving, resilience, empathy. So I'm a science teacher, that's my area of content. But I'm a teacher of students. I'm a teacher of children that will be in the workforce one day. And my job is to develop these skills in my students. I use science as my context to be able to develop these skills. But that's really what I'm doing. I'm using the Big Bang as a context to be able to learn these things. Not many of my students are going to become cosmologists. I'd like to think some of them will, but not all of them will. But we can develop transferable skills. Now, IBM did a study several years ago, in fact 10 years ago now, and they interviewed CEOs from all around the world, thousands of them, across lots of different industries, and they asked them, what are your priorities when you're employing workers? And they identified just two priorities: adaptability to change and creativity in generating new ideas. These are the skills that are transferable across any industry, any job. This is my why. I want to be developing students who are adaptable and creative. The future is already here. So what is my why? I want to develop skills in students so that when they're faced with a problem they've never seen before, they choose to think, not remember. Those skills are transferable to any different industry, any different job. If I'm not doing that, I'm doing my students a disservice. That's my why. We need students who can solve the problem. Let's work the problem, people. Trying to put a square peg in a round hole. So that's my why. Thank you very much. So we started to look yesterday about the how. John talked about the 2 sigma problem. I want to delve into that in a little bit more detail now, the 2 sigma problem. So those of you who weren't here yesterday, I think there's a few of you, John talked about this groundbreaking work done by Benjamin Bloom, who I'm sure you know from the hierarchy. And basically what he did, he and his graduate students collected a tremendous amount of data from different classrooms around the world. And they found that students who underwent mastery learning had performance in exams 1 standard deviation in front of those students in a traditional classroom. Remember, we're talking about exam performance here, and I think that's important to remember. That's what they measured. But they also found that when students underwent one-to-one tutoring plus mastery, that's important as well, plus mastery, they had 2 standard deviation improvement in their performance. Now, Bloom spent the rest of his career trying to identify opportunities to be able to replicate that same sort of improvement you get with one-to-one tutoring in a class of 30 students. So we did talk about mastery yesterday. Essentially, mastery, students work at their own pace. When they're ready to, they take a test, a mastery check, and they need to demonstrate a certain level of mastery before they move on. Another really important part there is if they're not yet demonstrated mastery, there's individualised correctives. So they go back and do individualised work to fill in the gaps that they have. So they don't have to learn everything again, just individualised. So I think that's important. But Bloom then went on to say, well, what is it about one-to-one tutorials that are more beneficial? And he said, well, it's because of the relationship between the student and the tutor. It's about being able to provide real-time, regular, very, very specific feedback, far more specific feedback. And then it's also about being able to motivate and reinforce to the students, keep them interested and motivated. So, John spoke yesterday about how flipped mastery can help us achieve this. And I'd actually like to take it a little bit further as well, because I actually think that flipped learning can, well, I want to show you other ways in which flipped learning helps us to achieve that 2 sigma, solve the 2 sigma problem. Now, one thing that Bloom also says, which I'm not quite sure if I believe in, he says that mastery comes before creativity. So basically he's saying that we need to focus on mastery and creativity will come. I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case. I'm not sure if we can't be working on creativity at the same time. But, you know, I mean, that's my opinion. I'm not quite sure. Something to think about, though. Okay, so as Amy said, I've just finished doing my masters, my research masters. Now, what I looked at when I did my masters is I looked at how I can support early career teachers to implement learner-centered teaching practices. Now, you're probably rolling your eyes and thinking, okay, I just heard about mastery yesterday. Now, Steve's talking about learner-centered. Why am I doing that? Well, just like mastery, there's a massive amount of research across all the fields of education talking about learner-centered practices. So what I did is I looked at demonstrating how flipped learning is a learner-centered practice. So you can just nod politely when I say learner-centered and just be reassured by the fact that there's even more research that suggests why this actually works. So what is learner-centered pedagogy? Well, they're constructivist practices. So constructivist in that the theoretical basis of it is that students are constructing their own version of knowledge. They focus on high academic achievement in a caring, supportive environment. They focus on the student as the centre of the classroom. Focus on the student or the learner and learning, not the teacher and teaching. So what I did is I looked at the research on learner-centered practice and found that there's massive amounts of research in support of learner-centered practices. And you can read those. One of the biggest contributions I made, I think, in my research was I looked at the learner-centered pedagogy literature and I distilled it down to 4 key characteristics. And I think this is important because I've been able to then demonstrate how flipped learning supports each of those. I think it's important for me as a professional because I use those 4 pillars when I'm planning my lessons, when I'm reflecting on the effectiveness of my lessons. So what are they? Learner-centered practices have differentiated instruction. Learner-centered practices build positive relationships between students and the teachers. They provide students with choice and control over their learning. And the learning is active. So for me, if I've done these things in my lesson, then it's a good lesson. When I'm planning a lesson, I want to make sure I'm covering off on all of these points. And I want to step through with you how flipped learning actually supports them. And I can tell you this for sure because in my research I followed 3 early career teachers for the first 2 years of their teaching. I provided them with flipped learning curricular resources with the hope that it was going to assist them to implement learner-centered teaching practices earlier. And I interviewed them, I observed their practices over a 2-year period. And I was able to observe, sure, there was that dip at the beginning and that survival for the first term, but after that they were able to implement learner-centered teaching practices. And this is what I found. First of all, David Gonski expects that we have differentiated or individualised learning plans for each of our students. How many students do you teach? I've got about 90 plus. No, more than that, sorry, about 120. Very, very difficult. But we can differentiate with flipped learning because the videos are individualised. The students pause and rewind and watch the videos at their own pace. That by itself is differentiation. The teacher is freed up to spend the most time with the students that need the most help in class. And because the teacher is in front of the students, the teacher is finding out about their interests and their preferences. So we can differentiate that way by accommodating student differences and interests. And of course, if students are absent, they're not disadvantaged. Now, you might have seen this in the paper a couple of weeks ago, talking about the Year 9 dip. That dip in performance, that dip in behaviour and the motivation that Year 9 students seem to demonstrate. And this research says it's actually not hormones. It's the fact that they feel like Malcolm in the Middle. So, you know, there's a real focus on junior high school, bringing the kids into the school, and obviously from Year 10 there's a focus on senior. Poor old Year 9s are in the middle, feeling unloved. So we have a great opportunity to build relationships with our students. Help them see that the learning is relevant to them. So the teacher gets a chance to interact with every student in every class every day. John said yesterday this is probably the most important thing, and I absolutely agree. This is what keeps me keeps me in the classroom, is building relationships with students, and I'm sure you'll all agree. Without a doubt, there's more time one-on-one with every student. We get to learn the students, and I said that, okay. Now, so mastery, John was talking about yesterday, and mastery checks, which I do, but I'm actually assessing mastery every time I walk around and have a conversation with the students. From a qualitative point of view, I'm getting an idea of their grit, of their mindset, their understanding, but their agency and things as well. So I'm making a mastery judgment of the whole person, not just their scores, which are important, of course, but I want to know about the whole person. How's that whole person feeling about the content and about their learning at that point in time? But I think it's important. So Year 9 is my area that I'm really passionate about, keeping them engaged in my area of science. But it's about engaging and not entertaining, and I think that's important. I'm not just doing show lessons just to engage with entertain people. I want to actually engage them in the learning to develop those 21st century skills. So we're going to do a little collaborative task now where I'm going to get you guys to watch this video a few times, and I want you to try and solve it. This is, so talking about relevance, it's related to Year 9 science curriculum, but the hook is, it's kind of like the Harry Potter cloaking illusion. So I want you to have a look at this video, and we're going to watch it a few times, and I want you to try and work out how they did it. Tracy talked yesterday about something that's really important for student choice and control. Wait. We'll catch up at morning tea. Yep. Okay. Normally, you're right, Matt, you're absolutely right. Thanks for heckling. I asked you to do that. Normally, obviously, we wouldn't move on. But you're quite right. And that's the great thing, is we've got the time for that struggle. We've got the time in the flipped classroom to allow students to work these problems and struggle. And Pete, to make their brains sweat. That's what we want. I think Pete might be asleep today. Okay, so student choice and control is super important. Giving students the pace of their learning, pausing and rewinding the video, is one really easy way of giving students some choice and control. Now, we've got set curriculum that we have to cover, so we can't just say go and play and go and explore in most subjects. So we're limited sometimes in how much control we can give students and how much choice, but the good news is you actually don't need to give them very much to make a difference. It comes down to a theory by Ryan and Deci called self-determination theory. It's a very, very important, well-known theory about motivation. And they've identified that there's three key things that are important for motivation. Autonomy is the one about choice and control. But as well as that, relatedness means how well do you relate to your instructor? So that's about the relationships. And the third one is about competence. That's about self-efficacy. It's about how confident you are in being able to do the work. And that comes down to the mastery. So it fits in really, really nicely as a theory of motivation. If we can cover all of those things, we improve the motivation of our students. Okay, and then we've got active learning. At the end of the day, we've got more time to do active tasks, like the one we just did and like the one we're going to do now, which is going to be interesting. So Steve and Beth are going to just hand out the bags, and if you can just pass them along, between 2 or 3 people, probably 3, I want you guys to have one of these mystery cubes. All right, so I want you to have Frank at the top, put it down on the table, and I want you to turn it around, and I want you to make some observations. Ultimately, what we want to do is work out what name would be on the underside. Was that task active? Was it learning? Wow. Yeah. So, could it be learning in a science context? Yeah, because that's the nature of science. That task would be an active learning task that I would do to help students learn about the nature of science. Now, you may well want to take it away and do, but you can't have my blocks. But you may well go away and take it away and find another context to put it in. But we need a context. Like, you can't critically think about nothing. You need a context to be able to critically think about. And for me, it's science. But really, ultimately, what I'm trying to develop is critical thinking. Collaboration. Creativity. Communication. And a vehicle like that is a great way for us to be able to do it. You know, looking at the difference between when I was talking compared with when you guys were working together, it's tremendously different. And it's like that obviously in your classroom as well. And that's what learner-centered pedagogy is about. It's giving students an opportunity to be able to work together. Frees me up to be able to spend time with my students. Okay, so Holly says I've gone from a C to an A, which is fantastic. There's no doubt about that. But sometimes I'm worried, and I overhear the conversations in the staff room where a teacher might say, oh, I've got Year 10s or I've got Year 11s, and have they ever been taught how to balance equations? You know, and it appears that they've got no transfer of their learning from one year to the next. I guarantee you I taught them balancing equations. So there's performance in an exam, and then there's knowledge that sticks, knowledge that they can recall in the next year and apply again. I actually wonder if the teacher, if they had provided a problem where the students had to really dig deep on their previous knowledge without just saying, have you ever balanced equations before? I wonder if they would be able to dig deep and recall that knowledge. I'm not sure. But that I always worried about that. And I'm thinking that it's not just about performance on exams. It's about being able to keep that knowledge and make it stick. So one of the problems of the 2 sigma problem is it's about performance on exams. I think this has gone kaput again. Okay, so a really important study that was done by the United States Air Force Academy. You've got to remember, these students are the top of the top. So, and they're doing high-level mathematics. But what they identified is that the professors who were able to get the students to do really, really well on the exams contemporaneously for that particular subject, we actually found that those students in the long term didn't perform as well. And the argument perhaps was that they were teaching to the test. There was a more shallow understanding of the content. And maybe the students left those subjects with those high marks and had a false sense of their ability, so didn't study as much later on. So I just think we need to be cautious about, it's not just about good performance on the exams contemporaneously. We need to be thinking about the long term. But interestingly, this is a university study where student evaluations are really, really important. So what they actually found is that the students who did really well initially, those professors were given really, really high evaluations. The ones where the students had to really struggle in class, their professors weren't evaluated as well. Because effort can sometimes be misrepresented as poor learning. And this is why sometimes students don't like active learning. There's a number of studies that have found this, that when students are in an active classroom, they're working hard. It's struggle. So they associate that with not actually learning very well. Compared with in a lecture where they're just sitting there listening to the professor, it kind of makes sense because the professor tells a good story and pulls it together really well. They kind of forget about their struggle when they're at home. So that's one of the reasons why students are resistant to taking on active learning, because it is hard. But you know what? Learning needs to be hard. Struggle is important. This is a bit of a busy graph, but it's important as well. Okay, so here's another study. I want you to have a look here. This is US and this is Australia. This is mathematics, high school, and I want you to compare. So they looked at different types of questions. These are using procedures and these are making connections, so transfer sort of problems. Or procedural learning and conceptual learning, as Tracy talked about yesterday. So if we have a look at the US, and Australia is very, very similar, if we have a look, this is the actual questions that were posed, but then by the time they were worked on by the students, this is the reality of it. So there was lots of procedural, there was some making connections problems here, but the reality is the making connections problems, when the students actually did them, there was one. So somehow a making connections problem became into a procedural problem by the time the students worked it. In other words, the teachers gave them so much scaffolding that they took away any benefit of the transfer, any benefit of the struggle, any benefit of the desirable difficulties. And if you have a look at Australia, it's exactly the same. So we went from 15 to 2. But if you have a look at Japan, see how many, I'm not sure if this is working anymore either, see how many in Japan, how many of those connections problems were retained and they perform better. So take-home message from this study is that we need to design questions that allow students to make connections, but then we need to not give them too much scaffolding. We need to give them time, give them an opportunity to struggle so they can draw on their background knowledge and give them an opportunity to transfer. So performance can be a poor proxy for learning. Enhanced short-term performance doesn't necessarily mean that they've developed skills and knowledge that they can transfer to new situations. So when I'm designing my lessons, you saw that I had an in-class flip mastery model there. One of my learned participants in my study, he gave me the feedback that he said, he or she, that it maybe was a little bit too individualised. There wasn't enough of an opportunity for collaboration. And I reflected on that in my own practice and I thought, that's just so spot on. That's what's actually missing in my practice. Students are doing well on the tests because I'm giving them lots of opportunities to practice. I'm making it easy for them to learn with the videos and everything. But I'm not giving them enough opportunity to struggle. So I've gone away from the in-class flip. Now I'm posing the videos for the learning with the videos for homework. And in class now is collaborative group learning tasks where I'm providing difficult tasks for them to struggle. And it's great fun. It's awesome. I like them both, but I actually think that this one is probably more beneficial for my students. Now, I could have probably called my study, but called this presentation today. How do I suck as a teacher? Let me count the ways. When I did my research, reading all of this research, it made me realise how many ways that I actually suck. But I guess that's the first part of reflection, isn't it? And being prepared to be able to learn from it and move on and kind of just get that little bit better. And I've got a long way to go, trust me. So desirable difficulties. Struggle is super important for student learning. So what does that actually look like? This is what it looks like for me.
Had is... Not had. They did. Not had. To be. They did. No. That's the do. Yeah. Aren't they? I'm sure.
That's Delphine. She's my French teacher. She's absolutely adorable. She's so patient. And you know, I show my students that sometimes because I want to show them that struggle is good. I love learning French because it makes me realise how hard it must be for my students to learn sometimes. But struggle is good. I used to joke, because I do it with my family. We have French lessons with my family, and I'm the slowest learner in the class. And I thought that was a problem, but I actually now realise that that's probably my superpower. Slow learning, there's nothing wrong with being a slow learner. Being a slow, effortful learner is actually great. That's grit. You know, that's that growth mindset. We want students to struggle with learning. We want students to know that it's okay for learning to be hard. Learning should be hard. If it's too easy, they're not doing it right. If it's too easy, we haven't designed tasks to engage them enough, to make them be able to make connections. So, how do we do it then? So what does desirable difficulties look like? So the way we make knowledge stick is through our mastery checks, testing. Testing helps make knowledge stick. So tests are wonderful. Now space practice as well. So the opposite of space practice is block practice, where you all do the same problem and then the next day you do the next of the same problem. Space practice is obviously split up. Space practice makes the knowledge stick because every time they have to go back and retrieve it, go through the hippocampus and pull the knowledge out, and every time we do that we're solidifying, making those synapses and those connections in the brain. So they help it stick, but we want to have knowledge that can be transferred to solve new problems. And so how do we do that? Well, one of the ways is through interleaving, and that is being able to solve different problems using the same knowledge. So looking at different contexts to apply that same concept. So in Year 9 Science this year, we're doing feedback loops. We've applied the concept of feedback loops to biology, to ecology, and now to space. So they're really getting the idea of feedback loops. So it's interleaving, coming up with that same idea, but applying it differently. So that's really important. But also is making connections. Making connections with the real world. So we kind of did that with the cloaking illusion. And what's really powerful here is relevance, but analogy. Analogical thinking is super important. So I kind of gave you an analogy with the Periscope. I put this up at the beginning of, as you guys were coming in, I don't know if you had a chance to read it. So you're a doctor. Patient's got inoperable stomach cancer. You can apply radiation, but you need a really high dose to be able to kill the tumour. And if you did that, it would actually damage and kill the healthy tissue as well. So how are you going to solve that? While you're thinking about it, I'm going to tell you another story. So we've got this fortress, and we've got two opposing armies. One army's in the fortress, and the other one wants to take over the fortress. There's all these roads heading towards the fortress, but each of the roads has mines, landmines in the road. The opposing army general, the one that wants to take over the castle, knows that if he can get all of his troops to the castle at the same time, they'll be able to overcome the castle. And he realises that if he puts all of his troops around each of the roads and sends some of them up each of the roads at the same time, and they arrive at the same time, they'll all be there and they'll be able to overtake the castle. And that's what they do. So getting back to this problem here. Inoperable stomach cancer. What are you going to do? While you're thinking about it, I'll give you one more story. So there's a house that's on fire in a little village. All the townsfolk are grabbing their buckets and they're running down and filling it up with water from the creek, and they're coming up and they're throwing it on the fire, and it just fizzes away because it's just one bucket of water is no match. But then when the fire chief arrives, he says, "Stop what you're doing. I want everyone to grab their bucket, go down to the creek, fill it with water, and all come around and circle the house. Then when I count to 3, 1, 2, 3, throw the bucket of water on the house." So that's what they do. 1, 2, 3, all throw their water, and it's enough to put the fire out. So let's go back to this problem. What are we going to do? Anyone? I can see some, yeah.
Would you put medium intensity rays around the tumour?
So from different
points.
Yes,
around.
that's exactly what you would do. And this is a really famous study, and they actually found that only about 10% of people can solve the problem when they first read it. But hearing the analogies, those two stories, nearly everybody's able to solve it, or a significant increase in the number of people that are able to solve it. And interestingly, the more abstract the analogy is, the better it works for some reason. It's crazy. That's analogical thinking, and it helps students to make connections. I just want to very briefly talk again about the research that I did, because it was about sharing curricular resources. So copy that down. No, joking. It was about sharing curricular resources. So I've made lots of videos and put together workbooks of, so they're actually just printed, stapled workbooks for the students to use, and lots of active learning tasks. And I shared them with these early career teachers, and it assisted them to implement learner-centred practices. Now, we actually share these resources with all of the teachers for Year 9 at my school. For me, it seems to make no sense at all that the 12 teachers would be making their own resources. When I was a physiotherapist, I worked for Coles, and we had 600 stores in Queensland, thousands in Australia. We were implementing a new safety management system. We didn't get each of the stores to make their own safety management system. That would make no sense at all. We made a generic safety management system, sent it out to the stores, and said, you need to customise it for your store. Same thing here. I would like to see the teachers spending their time differentiating their instruction, building relationships with their students, all of those things, and not spending time creating the same resources that I've already created. I'm not saying my resources are perfect, but it's a starting point for them. And what's great now is that we've got more teachers on board actually creating the resources, which is fantastic. So we are sharing. But we're not reinventing the wheel. Learner-centred, teacher-centred. It's not a dichotomy. It's a continuum. Some of my lessons are more over this way, some of them more over this way. That's okay. It's going to happen. And in fact, fully learner-centred might be, Montessori, go and play, and I hope you meet the learning goals. But, we're not trying to say that. We're trying to say, let's see what we can do to shift the needle that way a little bit in every one of our lessons. Okay, I'm actually just going to leave it with this. This is hard work. When you try to reach every student every day, you realise how hard it is to reach every student every day. It's certainly worth doing. Don't expect to be perfect. But it's something to aspire to. I think it's aspirational. It's aspirational for us to be learner-centred. It's aspirational for us to reach every student. But it's certainly worth trying. Thank you.